We wanted to start off by talking about what research is finding about kids and smartphones and teens and smartphones. And this could be a factor in trying to answer that ever-present question of whether parents should buy smartphones or tablets for their kids. There's a new book just out today. It's called iGen, small I and then Gen, like iPhone. The book looks at the psychological impact of smartphones on kids and the iGen generation. Some of the research out there suggests a gradual slowing of growing up. What does that mean? Well, the book's author, Jean Twenge, is with me. She teaches psychology at San Diego State University and grew up in Winona. So it's good to have you on the phone here, Jean. Thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Also joining us this hour, Troy Wolverton, senior tech editor for Business Insider. He's written about his own debate with himself on whether to buy his son an iPhone, but he also covers the tech industry. So, Troy, I'm glad to have you along here as well.
Glad to be here.
Gene, the premise here is whether we should buy smartphones for kids. That's the premise of this show, and if so, at what age? But your book is more than that, so I'm going to read the full title. iGen, Why Today's Super-Connected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy, and Completely Unprepared for Adulthood, and What That Means for the Rest of Us. Well, that's a lot there, Gene. Let's start cutting that apart. What's going on here? What did you find in your research?
Well, I've been researching generations for about 25 years, and I keep an eye on these big national representative surveys of teens and young adults out there. And around 2012 or so, I started seeing some pretty big shifts in teens' behavior, in their attitudes, how they spent their time, and also in their mental health. So smartphones were not my original topic. They weren't really what I started with. I started with what teens were saying on these anonymous surveys and how it looked like we got a new generation, starting with those born around 1995. A lot of people thought millennials would go until about birth year 1999, but it was clear with that big shift around 2012 with these teens that there was a new generation on the scene.
This is actually, I don't want to gloss over, this is not the point of the book, but I don't want to gloss over what you just said there. One of the things you study is when a generation, like Generation X or the millennials, when it begins and ends. And you're suggesting, and you actually coined the phrase iGen for people born after 1995, you actually suggest that this generation's start is altered because of the effect that smartphones had on every aspect of life. Do I have that right?
More or less, yeah. Generational cutoffs are often arbitrary. Generational groupings are both too specific and too broad. There's a lot of issues with them. But, hey, we're humans. We use language to label things, and generations are no different. So they're useful shorthand despite their shortcomings. And that is more or less what happened with iGen, with these breaks, because, and I didn't realize this until I was further into the research, that date I mentioned around 2012, well, I found out later, because the Pew Center and others have done surveys on this, that also happens to be the year when the percentage of Americans who owned a smartphone crossed 50%. And I think most people can think about that year. That was also when you looked around and suddenly everybody was looking at their phone. So that was such a huge shift in how teens and adults, for that matter, spent their time, that there were obviously these trends for being online and on social media before that, but then once the smartphone arrived, it was really a sea change.
What are your questions about this research for Jean Twenge and for Troy Wolverton here? Your experience raising an iGen child, maybe you're a teacher as well. Again, we're talking a lot about people born between 95 and 2012 who have always had access to smartphones and social media. 1-800-242-2828, 651-227-6000. You can tweet me at WeberTom1 and do not call or text if you're driving. Troy, before we get into your personal anguish over this question which you've written about, how is this in the way you're covering it? Where are the tech companies on this topic? How aware are they of books like Gene's and these topics?
I don't know that I can speak for the tech companies in terms of their awareness of books like Gene's. What I would say is that I think that they are very aware of trying to get new users to their platforms, particularly if we're talking about the social media companies and the device makers, and trying to make their products desirable and attractive to younger users. And there's evidence that they are specifically targeting, in some cases, younger users.
So tell us briefly, before we dive back into Gene's research here, you wrote an article a few years ago that said, I'm not going to give my son a smartphone, and then
Right.
you changed course. You wrote an article later that said, guess what? I gave him a smartphone. I don't think you're alone, Troy. That's why I'm really glad you're on the show here. So walk us through your own thinking, especially related to the fact that you cover some of this stuff.
Right. So, you're right. I've covered technology for, nearly 20 years, and I've certainly, I was a tech reviewer for a long time. I'm very aware of tech gadgets. It's not like I'm, tech phobic or anything. But, I'm also aware of something I think that Gene talked about in her Atlantic article, which is that many of the prominent people in tech have made stands in terms of their own personal lives and families on when and where their kids have access to technology products. And they basically didn't give their kids like smartphones or tablets and things at a young age. And, that influenced my thinking to some degree. And, both reading about it, talking with childhood development experts, it's something that we've thought about, my wife and I, for a long time. And, so for instance, one of the recommendations that many childhood development experts would say is that, if you have a computer, that kids shouldn't have computers in their own rooms. And so, we follow that advice. We have a family computer, and it's in a common space. We have a couple of iPads, but they are family iPads. They're not the kids' iPads, and the kids know that if we want them, they need to give them back. And they, spend the night, the tablets do, in the kitchen, not in the kids' rooms. So, we have set all along boundaries on our kids' use of technology, but, it's also not like we forbade them from using technology. They had access to our phones at times. They had access to our tablets at times. They had access to computers. But, it's something that we've been wrestling with in terms of smartphones in particular, and with my son. My son is now 13. As he got closer to middle school, more and more of his friends were getting smartphones, and that's kind of what prompted the first piece I wrote, was that one of my colleagues, who has a son that is a year older than mine, gave her son a cell phone, and she ended up having all kinds of problems with her son and his use of the device. Mm-hmm. And that, too, influenced how I was thinking about it.
So let's dive into it a little bit, Gene. I mean, big picture here, one of the themes I get is that growing up is slowing down. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. So that's the first chapter of the book, and I should say at the outset that smartphones are only part of the picture in terms of growing up more slowly. It may have accelerated some of the trends, but really this is a much bigger cultural change about how we raise our children and how we have smaller families. So I looked at these samples of teens and how they spent their time and what things they did, and started to notice that things that adults do that children don't. Those are things that teens will do for the first time as teens, like driving, working at a paid job, dating, having sex, going out without your parents, drinking alcohol, all the milestones of the teen years. And today's teens are doing all of those things later. So if you look at, say, high school seniors, 17 and 18-year-olds, a much higher percentage of them have not done any of those things compared to previous generations. So about 1 out of 4 don't have a driver's license by spring of their senior year, and that used to be virtually universal in previous generations at the same age.
Right.
A much smaller percentage work at a job.
That was your
ever
freedom.
Go out on a date, all of those things.
Yeah, that was your freedom, right? I got to get the driver's license.
Right.
You have to do that.
Exactly. And so like there was one young man who I interviewed who said, well, I didn't get my driver's license because my parents didn't push me to get my driver's license. And I hear that and I think, what? It's supposed to be the other way around. It's the kid pushing the parents to get the license. And that's the other thing that's interesting. It doesn't seem like this is because of parents being really draconian and setting a lot of rules. That may be part of it. But iGen teens actually fight with their parents less than previous generations did when they were in high school, for example. So they seem to be willing participants. And so one of the reasons they might be willing participants is because they can communicate with their friends electronically, and the party's on Snapchat. So that the smartphone seems to have accelerated. These trends toward growing up more slowly among teens started with the millennials, those born in the 80s and early 90s. So they've got going in the 2000s, but they really accelerated once the smartphone was on the scene, possibly because of being able to stay connected with your friends by not going out of the house.
So I'm taking your questions as well. We have Jean Twenge here, author of this new book just out today. It's called iGen, Why Today's Super Connected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy, and Completely Unprepared for Adulthood, and what that means for the rest of us. We're also joined by Troy Wolverton, Senior Tech Editor for Business Insider, and he's written about his own debates with himself about whether to give his own son a smartphone. And I want to hear your experience, your questions, how you navigated this question. 1-800-242-2828, 651-227-6000. What about this worries you, right, Jean? I want to be very careful. First of all, we have to be careful about what causes what, and you do a good
Absolutely.
you do a good job of saying that I'm not. You do a good job of stating I'm not saying that smartphones cause children to have sex later in life or cause some of the mental illness issues you talk about in the book as well. But there is a connection I think you are trying to make. So it really dive into what that is.
Well, it went like this. So first, the first process was seeing those changes. So let's take mental health as an example. That right around 2012, the teens in these large surveys, there started to be a pronounced increase in symptoms of depression, in anxiety, in loneliness. Happiness, after it had been going up for teens for quite a while, started to go down around that same time. Then big national screening study finds 50% more teens in 2015 versus 2010 have clinical level depression, and then very similar pattern for suicide rates among 12 to 18-year-olds. So there's all of these signs of these mental health issues really starting to go up right around that same time that the smartphone comes on the scene. Well, just because things happen at the same time certainly doesn't prove that one causes the other, but it's suspicious. It makes you think, well, maybe there's a connection here. So then the next step is to go more in depth and to try to look at, well, among individual teens, is there a connection between spending a lot of time on screens and these mental health issues? And sure enough, there is across several data sets. My studies and others find teens and adults who spend more time on screens or social media tend to be less happy, more depressed, have lower well-being. So the analyses that I did on the teen samples, those were correlational. So there's always the possibility that, for example, the unhappy teens might then use social media more, so reverse causation. However, there's 3 studies by other researchers that do a pretty good job of virtually, not entirely, but virtually eliminating that possibility. So 2 followed people over time and found that using social media more led to more unhappiness, but that unhappiness did not lead to more social media use. Another was a true experiment, randomly assigned adults to either give up Facebook for a week or not, and found that those who gave up Facebook for a week ended that week happier, less depressed, and less lonely. So you take all of this together, and no, it cannot unequivocally prove that smartphones are the cause behind this increase in mental health issues, but it's a very suspicious pattern. It's sort of like being in court, that, would this be enough to convict beyond a reasonable doubt? Well, for some people, they might say yes. For some people, they might say no. But in a civil court, where you'd say the preponderance of the evidence, I think that's clearly there.
I want to go here to the phone to another Jean who's on the phone here in Minneapolis, who's going through some of this online too. Hi, Jean. Go right ahead. What are your thoughts here today?
Well, I'm really glad you've written this book. A couple of years ago, decided, my kids are 12, I have twins, and I decided 0 smartphone until they're in college and can afford to pay for it themselves, hopefully even later than that. I think it is beyond a reasonable doubt that this is dangerous for kids, and I've watched my friends with their older kids, and I've watched them just be decompensated over these smartphones. They're completely addicted. They're not having a social life. They're not exercising. I decided a couple of years ago, absolutely not, and now my kids just don't even ask anymore. They know it's not going to happen, and I think they actually appreciate it. So,
Jean, thanks so much for the call there. Troy, this is part of what you went through too. You laid down the hammer a little bit like Jean there did as well, but man, the reality of the world we live in makes that decision even hard to execute, doesn't it?
Well, it does. I mean, I went in, my son went into middle school, and we had kind of a similar attitude that he didn't need to have a smartphone. And really, I'm glad his first year of middle school that he didn't have a smartphone. And what he saw was that a lot of his friends at lunchtime would sit around watching videos on their smartphones. They weren't, interacting. They weren't, doing kind of things that I would have done when I was a kid, which is chatting with my friends. But then reality hit the next year. He got involved in cross country, and we had to worry about trying to schedule pickups and kind of figuring out where he was. And, he was having track meets. And so that reality of trying to get in touch with him and being able to coordinate activities with him meant that he kind of needed to have some kind of phone to be able to do that with. And we happened to have, the reason he got a smartphone rather than just a dumb cell phone was that we happened to have a smartphone, an old smartphone lying around the house, and we just kind of handed down an old smartphone. Now, I did try to take some precautions with it. Like I kind of locked down the operating system to some degree and limited the apps that he could use and limited his ability to install apps. But, what I found, and I think that something that needs to be kind of a balancing factor maybe is that, yes, I think kids can easily get addicted to these devices. And, yes, I think that, like, the social media people tend to do things to encourage that kind of addiction. On the other hand, he uses his smartphone in much the way that I used to use a landline phone when I was in middle school, which is to say it was my chief way of communicating with my friends. I used to spend hours on end when I was in middle and high school chatting on the phone.
Right.
And, I don't know that he certainly isn't talking on the phone all the time, but he does chat with his friends here and there. And it's kind of his way of talking to them.
Jean, what Troy just said there and what the caller said and what you've detailed in some of your writing about this really is, there's an interesting facet here about this isn't just a matter of the old people in this conversation saying, kids get off my lawn kind of a thing, because there seems to be a real self-awareness among these young people of what's going on. One of the young ladies you interviewed who was in a adapted part of your book here that ran in the Atlantic, this young lady said, we didn't have a choice to know any life without iPads or iPhones. I think we like our phones more than we like actual people. I believe this was a 13-year-old girl.
Yes.
That's a great level of self-awareness to identify what's going on.
And she wasn't the only one. That was one of the most interesting things. So, the basis of my book is these large surveys of, 11 million, but I also wanted to find out what's going on in their lives more in depth. So I did a bunch of interviews with teens as well. And that was one of the biggest surprises to me, was how many of them were fully aware of the downsides of this technology. Even 13-year-olds because she's literally never known a world without a smartphone. It's always been there ever since that she can remember. So And then I also did some open-ended surveys with some college freshmen and asked them, would you rather communicate with your friends electronically or see them in person? Almost every single one said, I'd rather see them in person. They could articulate exactly why. You can feel more emotional connection. You can hug them. You can see the look on their face. So it's almost like this technology kind of happened to them. And they, of course, are on it so often, but I think there's a couple factors there. The first, as Troy was mentioning, there's addiction involved, that these studies keep coming out suggesting that smartphone use is using the same brain chemicals as drug addiction.
Yeah.
And that's not my expertise, but it certainly is a thing that seems addictive. And the way the teens and young adults I interviewed talked about it, that's what it seemed like. It's almost they didn't really want to spend that much time on their phones, but it felt mandatory to them. And it also had that element of addiction. Like, I don't really want to, but I have to.
Right. Getting the ding for the message releases the dopamine. I mean, that's what we're seeing
Exactly.
as well. That we're talking to Jean Twenge. Her new book is called iGen. Troy Wolverton, senior tech editor for Business Insider, talking about what parents and I think their children are going through right now, whether to get those smartphones, how to do it in a smart way, when to do it, and the like. And we're taking your calls. We have a lot of calls here. Let's go to Kim, who's in Richfield. Hi, Kim. You're a teacher. Is that right?
Hi, yeah, I'm a high school teacher, and I would say that everything that has been said this morning I've seen for probably the past 10 years. As my favorite example is that kids used to go out in the hall between classes and talk to their friends and then race to get there before the bell would ring, and nobody does. They come to class, they sit down, and they start checking all their apps and can often be texting the kid next to them. So it's kind of a fascinating thing, and oftentimes I think it's taken some of their independence away. I've traveled with a lot of these kids, and when we didn't have cell phones for parents to stay in constant contact with them, they were a little bit more excited and adventurous, and now it's between the apps and connecting with their parents and getting on Facebook and showing what they're doing instead of actually living what they're doing.
So nobody's getting tardies anymore, Kim. They're going to class, but then they use those 5 minutes before class starts to send a few more texts.
That's what I'm seeing, and it's harder for us as teachers to say, okay, you got to put those away. And at the end of the hour, as you said, they race to see what happened while they were trying to do something.
Kim, thanks so much for the expertise. Always great to hear from teachers, too, as well. They're definitely on the front lines here, as are parents, as we talk about this with Jean Twenge and Troy Wolverton. Let's go to line one. Dwight is in Philadelphia. I think Dwight is a fellow researcher along with Jean, who's been listening here. Hi, Dwight. You studied this as well.
Right. I've been working on this for the last couple of years. I'm just about ready to release a documentary called Cellular Aftershocks. And I found it interesting that she referred to it as the I generation. I call it the smartphone generation. And I was looking at, is this the Z generation or the X generation? And
Right.
and I had to come up with my own label as well. And what your guests have said, sort of matches what I've said. But I've also talked to scientists across the country, probably the leading researchers in all these areas, and what they note is that this is really a game changer in human history. I talked to David Strayer, who's a leading researcher at the University of Utah, probably the top researcher in distracted driving. And he says, he compares it to fire and Gutenberg's press, and it's not, we had the internet, and that was a huge advantage in many respects. But now that we all can carry it in our pocket,
Right.
It becomes a huge thing. Now, I'm a college professor, and I have a colleague, and she's surveyed students, and she's found that 90% admit to texting during class 1 to 6 times each class period.
90%.
And every one of us has on our syllabus, you can't do that. But we know that virtually every student does do that.
Yeah.
And there's a question in the literature about whether this is an addiction or a dependency, and really, in a way, it doesn't matter because the effect is the same, because the dopamine rush really affects us all. Another thing to make sure to understand is that for adolescents particularly, the key issue is that the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed. That's the side front of the brain where we make decisions. Mm-hmm. And while adolescents can really feel the gratification, the dopamine, they're not able to make the full decision. And adolescence actually runs, in that definition, until you're age 25.
Right.
So it's really problematic, and it leads to all the problems that we've talked about: learning disabilities, depression, anxiety, short attention spans, loneliness, sleep deprivation. Sleep deprivation is a huge issue because they all virtually hide them under their pillows.
That's right. Yeah, Dwight, I'm glad you called because, Gene, that's something you found as well. I mean, the sleeping with the phone, I mean, a lot of people do just because it's their alarm clock now, but it actually then leads into, as you put together in the book and what Dwight did with his research, about sleep deprivation.
Yeah, so that's another thing that I looked at in these two big national surveys, one of which is administered by the CDC. So more and more teens don't get enough sleep. The percentage who sleep less than 7 hours a night has accelerated, again, right around 2012 or so. And not surprisingly, those who spend the most time on screens are also those who are most likely to not get enough sleep. So it's another case where the evidence is suspicious in pointing in this direction, whereas that changed right around the time smartphones became common and the connection among teens with sleep deprivation. And it's probably not just because they're spending so much time on the screens. It's because almost every young adult I talked to said that their phone is the first thing they look at when they get up in the morning. Well, that's okay, but it's also the last thing that they see before they go to sleep at night. So that's a very stimulating activity. Plus, physiologically, that blue light keeps your body from secreting enough melatonin. So it's kind of the worst thing that you can do right before bed. But not only do they do it right before bed, all of them told me they keep their phone at least in arm's reach. Some of them even have it on at night, which is clearly not a good recipe for sleep.
And to what Dwight was saying also, Gene, about this being a game changer, that's a theme I'm getting from your writing and other writing I'm seeing here too. Yeah, you know, you had CDs come along, you had the Walkman, you had all this technology through the years that every generation's different, and these darn kids with their rock and roll music. I get it. It's always going to be different, and it's always going to be perplexing to the older generations. But Dwight's comment and your themes that I've picked up from your writing are that this really is a moment, not just in the study of generations, but in human history. I mean, on par with making fire and the printing press. Do you agree with that?
I think so. I mean, TV was also huge, and TV isn't great either for mental health. And, you know, some people have concluded it's probably one of the reasons why we don't have as many community groups and get-togethers anymore. So that had a big impact as well. But it is true, smartphones kind of take it to the next level in that they're always with us. That because it's right there in your hand or at the least in your pocket or in your purse, that there's no getting away from it. And it just becomes something that is with you there in every moment of your life in a way that just kind of takes over. So that might be one of the reasons why those impacts on, say, teen behavior, like not spending as much time with their friends, and then their mental health and sleep and all of these other effects are showing up.
Troy, to that point, to what Gene was talking about, are the companies, I know what you said earlier about the companies wanting to get more users, are they trying to help address this issue as well? Are they seeing themselves coming in and for being bad guys and trying to help on the other end as well?
I mean, I have not seen, and maybe I've missed it, but I've not seen any of the companies seriously address the issue of how these devices and services are impacting kids. There are things around the edges. Apple introduced a feature on the iPhone called Night Shift, which tries to change the color of the screen at night to try to address some of the blue light that's coming out of the screen. But, you know, people that have looked at it say that it doesn't really do enough to change that. And There are some things that are being done. I think in the next version of the Apple operating system, there's going to be some things to lock out people from texting and driving. So there are some serious efforts in some things, but in terms of the impacts on kids, I don't think there is very much going on in that direction. And in fact, one might argue that the opposite is the case. A lot of these companies have learned from psychological studies and have learned from video game design, and they, specifically design their apps or social networks and or devices to give that dopamine hit, to encourage people to keep coming back to the site. And it's not just kids. It's like, my wife, for instance, decided recently, we went on a vacation and she turned off Facebook and then decided that she wanted to stay away from it for a while. And Facebook started sending her messages, like notifications, and they started sending her text messages.
Right.
I mean, it's
we're
like
worried about
away
you.
from these things.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's the way these systems are designed, is that they're designed to lure you back into them and to encourage you to use them repeatedly.
Let's go back to the phones here with Gene Twenge and Troy Wolverton. Carlos in Minneapolis. Hi, Carlos. What's your experience?
Hi.
Go right ahead.
Well, in my house, me and my kids were using the cell phones 100%.
Yeah.
We decide to go ahead, and even when we're inside the house, we call each other, or we text each other, or we communicate each other that way. My son, he's 5 years old, and my other son is 8, and my daughter is 13. They all have their phones, and we all communicate that way. We Google together, sometimes separate. We share stuff, and we take this up to like the full speed. We're doing all that.
Yeah.
I feel like I don't see anything major with that. Like they can't sleep or anything like that. I don't see any changes. I just feel like we're getting used to be this way. I mean,
Yeah.
like just a few minutes ago, my daughter texted me that she loves me, and I thought it was very sweet, But we're taking it like 100% the technology. We're just facing it
Carlos.
instead of running away.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And Gene, Carlos is leaning into it. I'm trying to get in our final minutes here. I know you have to leave in a few minutes. To what Carlos said and to what other people said, where do you think the answers lie? Where maybe you go the Carlos route of just leaning into it. What's the list to put together of things to remember, of how to do this, of whether to do this with kids and smartphones?
I think one thing is that moderation is the key. So I found, as others have as well, that the negative effects on mental health for smartphones don't start to show up until about 2 hours a day of use. So using a smartphone an hour and a half a day, using social media that amount, doesn't seem to have much of a negative effect. But 2 hours a day and beyond, that's where the effects show up. Of course, most teens and many adults are using their phones more than that. So there's plenty of room for limit setting. There's apps parents can get, for example, to restrict the amount of time that their kids spend on phones. Another is to think about their age and the kid herself or himself about how much they can handle. So in some cases, the mental health effects are stronger for the younger teens, say the 8th graders versus the 12th graders. So there's that to think about as well. And it also is, what I looked at was just number of hours, but it's also what you do with it. If it's your family sitting together talking about things, that probably doesn't have a negative effect. We don't know that for sure, but that's usually not what people are doing. That the technology of the smartphone was supposed to bring us together, and at first that's what people would do. They would say, hey, look at this video and so on. But now it's more isolating. It's led to scenes for people of all ages where you have people sitting together and they're all looking at their own phones. It's isolated us in many ways.
This is going to be a jump, Gene, and I apologize for this, and you can push back for me, but with what we've seen recently in Charlottesville, I've had conversations about white nationalists and white supremacists, people who study these groups, who say there's a healthy population of young people joining these groups. It's not the post-racial world that Obama's election was supposed to be. The man who drove the car, 20 years old, is that playing into the research you do, people joining fringe groups like this, is that, seeking that community, is there something there, Jean, with what we're talking about here today?
Well, in fact, I have an op-ed on Time Magazine, at time.com today, talking about iGen's political and racial views. So it really stood out to me in thinking about Charlottesville and trying to look at some of the data from these big surveys. There's one question that asks them about what kind of environment would you like for your school, your neighborhood, your workplace? Do you want a diverse environment? Or do you want one that's all the same race as you? So if you look at, say, white high school seniors, 17% in 2015, so right with iGen right now, 17% are saying, I'd like an all-white environment. That's not zero. It's not even 5%. That's 1 out of 6. So there's still a critical mass, even though that's much less than it used to be. It's been cut in half since the 70s, but there's still enough. And then you make a good point, too, that if teens aren't finding community and finding belonging in their day-to-day lives, in some cases they might look elsewhere. And in some cases they're going to look to online communities, which will help them feel connected if they don't know people with their identity in their neighborhood. But in other cases, it can mean they look to more negative groups like hate groups.
Let's go back to the phones here. Ben is in Roseville on line 1. Hi, Ben. I believe you're 19. Is that right?
I am 19, yeah. And I just kind of wanted to point out, for me, it was kind of ironic. I downloaded an app on my smartphone called Moment that intensively tracks my phone usage and provides reminders of, like, how much I've used my phone on the day. And it made a massive difference in not only my usage but also my mental health. I went from using my phone 4.5 to 5 hours a day to a little over 20 minutes a day in 2 weeks. And it's been a huge difference on how I feel throughout the day, the time I spend with friends, my productivity overall. Yeah.
Ben, thanks so much. I really appreciate that. Jean, as we make our list or think about what to do next, is an app like that a good idea?
Yeah, just anything to have the smartphone be something you're using to make your life better, to make your life more convenient, instead of having it take over your life. Because let's face it, staring at that phone all the time is not a way to be present in your own life. So sometimes I say use it as a tool. You're using it instead of it using you.
Jean Twenge, author of a new book out just today called iGen, Why Today's Super Connected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy, and Completely Unprepared for Adulthood, and what that means for the rest of us. A professor of psychology at San Diego State University. Minnesota native, Jean. I know you have to leave here, so I'm going to let you go. I'm going to keep Troy here for another minute, but Jean, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Troy Wolverton with us here for a few more minutes from Business Insider. And Troy, I want you to get your reaction to this next call here. Rick is in Minneapolis. I think he's going through some of the things you were, Troy. Rick, what are your thoughts today?
Hey, thanks for taking my call. I've been an early adopter for digital technologies of all kinds for as long as they've been around. I'm 57 years old, so I've been around a little while. But this conversation keeps happening at these different junctures. Like, it reminds me of the conversations I heard on NPR when the internet first started to become a popular thing, right?
Yeah.
The iPhone's a tool. It's like a hammer. And as with a hammer, you can build beautiful things or you can kill people with them. So rather than think about ways that we limit your children's access to this tool, just teach them how to use it.
Yeah.
You've touched on a lot of the things, and your last guest that had to leave kind of touched on my point. It's that it's not the phone. It's what we access with it, and it's our constant ability to access it that quickly. So maybe the conversation should be more about, yes, get your kid a phone and teach them how to use it responsibly, just like any of the other things that you brought into your household over the years.
Rick, I appreciate it. We're going to let you go and let Troy get the last word, because Troy, I feel like what Rick talked about is exactly the thing you went through and I think got to in the end, right?
Well, I think I agree with Rick to a large degree that, kids are going to have technology in their lives, and they're going to need to know how to use this technology and to use it in ways that are useful and productive. On the other hand, you wouldn't hand a 5-year-old, most people wouldn't hand a 5-year-old a revolver. Most people certainly wouldn't hand a 5-year-old a submachine gun. There are tools and there are tools, and some tools are more dangerous than others. And, there are tools that we need to, not only do you need to be thoughtful about how people use those tools and teaching your kids to encourage them to use them properly, but you also need to be aware of what those tools can do and the effects those tools may be having on the users themselves. It's quite likely that the dopamine hits that we get from our phones or from social media is changing our brains. It's changing how we interact with the world around us. And, you can't just hand a kid a tool and expect them to know it, and you can't hand a tool and think that you can teach them everything about how to interact with it. I think you also need to be aware of how ready they are for that particular tool and how it might change who they are and what they do, how they interact with the world as they use it. I think what Gene was talking about trying to encourage moderation is an important thing. I think being conscious of your kids' maturity is an important thing. I think that we introduce different things to kids at different ages, and I think the same thing goes with technology. A 5-year-old is probably not ready to have a smartphone. A 13-year-old may be ready to have a smartphone. But, even a 13-year-old, you probably need to set limits in terms of, one of the things that we do is that we demand that he put his smartphone in the kitchen at night to charge it. He doesn't have it in his room at night. So, that's part of being a parent, right? Part of being a parent is that you are supposed to set limits for your kids and be aware of what's age appropriate for your kids. And, it doesn't change with technology.
Troy Wolverton, Senior Tech Editor for Business Insider. That's a good place to end it there. And I appreciate your thoughts as well and your perspective on this conversation. Thanks so much.
My pleasure, Tom.
And again, we had Jean Twenge, author of the new book just out today called iGen. She teaches at San Diego State University.